Doctors' wage demands. I'm producing this as a three-part video lecture with Paul Cockshott, who's a Marxist political economist. It's based upon a polemic that I wrote against the current position of the doctors' trade union in the UK and the middle class position of doctors in general. The polemic draws upon methods described by Paul in various video lectures and publications on how to establish the class income of a group using national pay data. If you want the full argument and references, you can follow this link where I've turned the original polemic into a blog post that you can read. Now, today in part one, we're going to look at the average income of doctors and their pay demands. In part two, we'll look at internal class relations, the pay of seniors, and some resolutions to pay inequalities. And in part three, I'll address counter arguments that I've come across and draw some conclusions. Just a bit of background on myself first. I'm a junior doctor that's currently employed in the NHS. I'm FY1 grade, or what might be called a house officer, so I've just started in professional medicine. I graduated last year with an MBBS and BSc in neuroscience, and I have previous affiliation with the UK Communist Party. Now, why bother with any of this? We live in a time in the UK where the state is actively arresting protesters en masse. Protesters who are opposing the prescription of peace organizations that themselves are protesting the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So it might not seem a particularly important or relevant issue, but if you live in the UK, you'll know that junior doctors have been striking for several years over demands for pay rises, and this continues despite several pay rises already. The latest round of strikes concluded at the beginning of this month, August. The British Medical Association, which is the doctors' trade union in the UK, publishes a narrative that dominates mainstream media. And I'm going to say they make elitist claims. Now, despite these elitist claims, left-wing parties have admitted support for doctors' strikes in general. To my mind, this leads to some serious bourgeois deviations. It leads to an acceptance of the wages system and of the special interests of the middle classes. Parties that accept these things tend to make false claims about the class position of physicians. It also allows us to explore perhaps a less commonly discussed topic, which is internal class relations, and how emergent income gradations under wage differentials lead to subclass formation in capitalist society. Now, what are my claims? Well, on the whole, doctors are members of the non-exploited middle classes. They are, on average, better paid than the majority of the population. While a portion of young doctors are paid at exploitative wage levels, the BMA tends to overrepresent them. And the consultant class, or the class of senior doctors in general, claims wage rents. And this exacerbates income inequality amongst doctors. It's why junior doctors are worse off relative to their senior counterparts. Now, when we're judging class position, one of the first guides that you can use is pay. Doctors in the UK are all salaried employees, and so pay is a useful way of comparing them to other UK waged labourers. What we find from ONS data, from occupational data, is that doctors' median pay in 2021 was £30.79 per hour, whereas UK median pay stood at £14.10 per hour. So a big gap, a greater than 2-to-1 gap in average income. But it's not enough just to look at the disparity in average incomes. You have to establish a yardstick that tells you how far these values are away from the average value produced in the UK. Now, to do that, you can look at the national income. And you take the national income for a given year and divide it by the workforce, the number of people employed. And that gives you a net product per employee. And you take that net product and divide it by an estimated hours worked per year. Now, this estimated hours worked, I'm assuming in its calculation 48 weeks worked per year. And I think that's a fair assumption because doctors as well will be working around 48 weeks per year. I receive 27 days annual leave. That's standard across the NHS, and that rises to 32 days after 5 years service. So 48 weeks worked in a year with a month's annual leave, I think is a safe assumption. And that gives you a value per hour of £37.33. That's the average value produced per worker in 2021. It's an estimated monetary equivalent of labour time. It gives you an approximation of what an hour's labour produces in value terms in the UK on average. And what we see is that doctors are far closer to receiving this average value compared to the rest of the UK. Now, why does that imply that they're middle class? Well, the greater than 2-to-1 ratio in income indicates a large advantage for doctors. And with fewer than 10% of employees claiming more than £1,000 a week, to be as well off as a mid-income doctor, and the mid-income being £30.79 is well above £1,000 a week. To be as well off as a mid-income doctor, you would have to be in the top 10% of all employed earners. And this can be confirmed with mean pay data, this advantage. The UK mean pay was less than half the doctor's mean pay. But you can't just take mean pay because it's heavily skewed. The enormous difference between the mean pay and the median pay indicates that. The underlying income distribution is heavily skewed because the top earners, the top salaried earners, are on very high incomes. But what you can do with mean pay is establish another exploitation threshold. The relative wage share stood at 49% in 2021. That indicates 51% of income is going as surplus rather than going towards wages. To establish the exploitation threshold, you need to add back the surplus onto the average pay. So you take 1 and divide it by this figure. That gives you a factor. It's going to be just over 2. And you multiply that factor by UK mean pay. And that gives you an estimated exploitation threshold of £64,000. The exploitation threshold is a set point around which non-exploitative incomes must vary. Now, to get a clue to what the range is, or what the variance is for those non-exploited incomes, what range will they be contained in? You can look at percentile income. I think a safe assumption is that you're at a non-exploitative wage level if you're between the 88th and 96th percentiles. If you're in the top 12 to 4% of earners, you're going to be around, or your incomes will cluster around the exploitation threshold. Anybody above £54,000 in 2021 was in the 88th percentile. And doctors' median pay exceeds this value. So that means more than 50% of doctors are in the top 12% of earners. And more than 50% of doctors exceed a lower bound for the exploitation threshold. And this is a much greater proportion compared to the proportion of people in the UK in general. Their median is far lower. What are the implications of this? Well, the vast majority of people are hugely exploited. At least 16 million workers are losing out on a possible 165% of purchasing power. Where's this purchasing power going? It's going to the upper classes. In 2021, they were receiving in excess of £32,000 on average per worker in surplus. Huge sums. As for doctors, well, they were much closer to receiving average value for 1 hour's work. How do we know this? Well, if we were to give them a melt pay rise from median, so to give them a pay rise from £31 to £37 in 2021, more than 50% of doctors would only receive up to 21.2% of a pay rise. Marginal compared to the rest of the UK. And all the figures that I've given so far are pre-wage rise figures, before any wage rises had been won. Now, that's in part because I started looking at this as a medical student, but it's useful to go back to that data because it shows us that even before pay rises had been won, doctors were in a much better position relative to the vast majority of people. So are doctors exploited? Well, no. If the average class income approaches the exploitation threshold, allowing for variance, it is by definition a non-exploited position. Just through employment earnings, doctors tend to get out from society what they put in. They are not exploiting, nor are they being exploited. Moreover, UK doctors are not producing surplus value, and as such, are not being exploited in the capitalistic sense. They're not involved in what Marx refers to as the production of relative surplus value. But of course, income and pay are not the only determinants of class position. There are other areas, and doctors have advantages in these areas as well. With so few doctors, the labour market is tight, and they receive standard contracts. Variance for pay within grades tends to be far less than in the private sector. They have rapid career progression and the pay scaling associated with that. A share of doctors work private shifts, and they receive higher rates for it. Doctors also receive enhancements for additional hours beyond the 40 hours mandatory basic. They'll receive this for evenings, nights, and weekends. And many doctors perform locum duties at exorbitant rates. Locum duties are optional duties. They are cover for unfilled roster spots, and they're negotiated independently with your employer, and they're not covered by the National Junior Doctors Contract. And they tend to be at much higher rates than the average. Doctors receive a multitude of training, teaching, and mandatory educational opportunities. And like myself, they receive opportunities for further degree education. Doctors will on average have larger savings, and we know this because an increasing share of doctors are taking career breaks or shifting onto part-time work schedules. So they must, at least in part, be able to support themselves out of savings. A portion of senior doctors are outright house owners rather than paying mortgage debts. There's a pressure to emigrate. Doctors can afford emigration. As part of the middle class, they tend to come from and have smaller families. They have fewer children on average, and so will have a reduced burden of domestic labour and childcare. Doctors tend to come from private or grammar education. They are graduates, and they receive the connections and intellectual life associated with that. Physicians are technocratic. They command other people to do work. Nurses, healthcare assistants, radiographers, they tell them what to do. And because of this technocratic position, they have a perceived merit. This grants them an elevated social status, and from here, they can win elections. They can win political campaigns, and they can come to hold political office. Now, of course, there are some class disadvantages. Doctors work long weekly hours. Long-term data indicates an average 44.66 hours for all doctors. Now, this data is taken from a study between 1997 and 2020 that compares the average work hours of GPs against other doctors. And the figure that they calculate for all doctors is between 44 and 45 hours. Contrast that with the current mean UK weekly paid hours. That stands at 33.2 hours. And that's been stable for the last 5 to 7 years. So clearly, doctors are working far more hours. Training is long, 5 to 6 years undergraduate, even more if you're postgraduate. Exam preparation is continuous, and internal competition for places creates bottlenecks. So not everybody advances at the same rate. Not everybody is able to advance onto an advanced training program. Recent graduates are laden with student debt. They're going to have piled up more than £70,000 of debt, and this will be at 4.7 to 7% interest charged on each loan payment that's been made. Reservedly, I'm going to say that it's feasible for doctors on average to face higher rates of absolute ground rent. Now, that's due to the urban centrality of hospitals, but it's not clear that that's the case because there's no robust data available for what portion of doctors are actually paying rent. Some doctors, like myself, live with their families. Some NHS boards, for example, Wales, offer free accommodation for doctors of my grade. And if you take into account what I said about house ownership, it's not an easy point to estimate, but it's a possibility. Work is also time critical, but morbid. Now, what does that mean? Early starts, fewer breaks, missed lunches, you don't always finish on time, and that equates to unpaid hours. If surgery overruns, it overruns. There's no going home early. Overall, taking into account class income and other class advantages and disadvantages, I estimate doctors, on average, are able to get back at least 1 hour's worth of value from society for every hour of labour they perform. They are typically middle class. Now that deals with doctors as a whole, but what about junior doctors? The latest round of strikes is for juniors specifically, now called residents. Junior doctors make up the minority of all doctors. There's over 100,000 seniors against 75,000 juniors. Both of these groups have separate contracts. The junior doctors contract covers all junior doctors nationally, all 75,000 of us. The BMA campaign tends to focus on the basic pay of the absolute bottom earning doctors. These are called foundation years, FY1, FY2, whom are recent graduates and the worst paid. Now, one thing you have to consider is basic pay only accounts for a contracted 40 weekly paid hours. In reality, junior doctors are working closer to an average 45 to 47 mandatory hours per week. Now, you might say, well, that's ridiculous. The European Working Time Directive is at 48 hours average. So a doctor's really working that many hours? Well, yes, they are. Junior doctors are spread so thin that we have to work extra hours. We have long working days and extra shifts being performed. And that pushes up our real average, our real weekly average of hours worked. However, the extra hours that we're performing are at enhanced rates. You get enhanced pay for evenings, weekends, and night shifts. This is why the hours are so high. You might do a normal shift, but if you have a weekend, you'll do an extra day of work. Or if you have an evening shift to do, you'll have an extended work day. Now, we need to look at real pay as an estimate versus basic pay to actually judge whether wages are at an exploitative level. And because NHS contracts are standard, I can use my own pay because it's going to be close to the average for all FY1s. I earned £42,419. And this is for 44 hours work per week across 48 weeks, giving me an hourly rate of £20.08. The basic hourly pay rate was £19.07. I earned an extra £1 or £1.01 per hour through non-locum enhancements. I didn't actually work any locum shifts, so this is what I would have earned for this year. and since August, last August. The FY1s, therefore, are certainly paid at exploitative wage levels. So the BMA thrusts us to the forefront of their campaign. On one hand, my pay is better than 50% of the population. On the other hand, it's still at an exploitative level. However, the important thing to note is that foundation doctors are not the majority of junior doctors. Doctors of my grade are not the majority of juniors. The larger share of juniors are Royal College members, earning closer to or over the exploitation threshold, even with just basic pay. And this larger share would also receive any pay rises for the National Junior Doctors contract. So let's have a look at this in detail. We've got the basic pay table for all junior doctor grades here. At the top here, we have the foundation year doctors, who are these recent graduates. And here, the trainees are the other junior doctors, the Royal College members, the core, the specialty. These are all people who have passed their Royal College entrance exams and are on an advanced training program. And all these people are considered junior doctors, regardless of what the pay disparity is. Now, we need to establish how many people actually occupy these different positions. Well, occupational data indicates that there are around 13,500 foundation grade doctors in the UK. Whereas other trainees number 63,000. So these doctors here are in the majority. That's over around a 5-to-1 gap in occupancy between the lower grades and the higher grades. Now, what does this imply? Well, it means the majority of junior doctors earned over £1,000 per week. The Royal College members, their starting pay, as given by the BMA pay tables for annual figures with an assumed 48 weeks worked, is over £1,000 per week. That's what the majority of junior doctors would be earning. And if we were to include enhancements, the higher grades would receive even more because they're working more mandatory weekends and night shifts despite a similar average weekly hours worked. So with the same or a similar average weekly hours worked, within that are contained more weekends, more night shifts, and you receive pay enhancements for that. So the important thing is not to be misled. A portion of juniors are certainly paid at well below the exploitation threshold. These in particular are the foundation year doctors, but they are in a minority. Occupational data indicates there are over 200,000 doctors employed in the UK. Approximately 15,000 of these are FY grade. As such, only 6.5% of all doctors are foundation doctors. Fewer than 20% of all junior doctors are FY1 or FY2 grade. Absolute minority. The foundation program lasts for 2 to 3 years on average. Now, trust independence. So trusts are the regional organizations for the NHS. These independent trusts can decide on how many training posts are made available. And if this is a limited number, then some doctors are going to be pushed into an unemployment threshold. They're going to be pushed into a group of unemployed workers. And in principle, this is going to be what Marx refers to as the stagnant reserve. And when this happens, when some doctors become part of the stagnant reserve army, this creates a media sensation and it gets reported in the news. You also have to pass exams because if you want to get into the Royal College and then get onto a trainee program, you have to pass your exams. And if you want a specific specialty, you have to have the relevant portfolio to get a place. But despite all these things, most doctors still progress beyond the foundation program within 2 to 3 years. And this causes a greater occupancy at the higher earning grades. The short length of the foundation program, the number of training spots available, the occupancy is far higher at the higher earning grades. And that pulls up the average income for juniors towards the exploitation threshold. So the real issue to my mind, it's not average pay rates for doctors per se, but it's the length of the working day caused by the systematic shortage of doctors. If the division of labour is so restrictive that few doctors can be trained, this will impact any internal division of labour. If there aren't enough doctors, it doesn't matter how you organise them or reorganise them, they're going to have to work extended hours to cover the unfilled spots. And this is what stretches their pay thin for the junior doctors who are below the exploitation threshold. It's what stretches their pay across so many hours. And the other problem, as we saw from the basic pay table, is the large internal pay differences. And once we include senior pay, if we look at consultant pay, this becomes very stark. And that and relevant resolutions to pay inequalities will be covered in the next part. Now, of course, the pay tables that I'm using are liable to go out of date because doctors are in the midst of winning pay rises. So you can follow this link if you want a look at the most recent published tables.